I've always enjoyed my private conversations with the American philosopher Daniel Dennett, and I knew the importance he attached to Darwin's theory of evolution in the development of disbelief. So I asked him why he'd called his book Darwin's Dangerous Idea. And one of the points he made was simply that the theory of evolution was easy to understand, and that's what made it so dangerously subversive.
Unlike some other great scientific advances, going back to Newton or certainly Einstein or best case perhaps quantum theory, unlike these bizarre revolutions, I think that Darwin's theory is really quite easy to understand. You don't need any math. The basic idea is so simple that you have variation, that inevitably, if there's variation in the population, some are going to be better than others, and the ones that are better than others are going to have more kids than the ones, than the less favored ones, and the offspring are going to resemble their parents. That gives you this little ratchet. And indeed, the idea that you could do that much lifting with a simple ratchet is a stunner. And most of the skepticism has been along the lines of, well, there's just too much work to be done by such a simple process. But time and again, it's been shown, no, there's enough time. The process is more powerful than you might think.
But you can understand why it was that at the beginning, these minute ratchets, minute teeth on the ratchet, would have been seen as implausible contributions to something which was an adaptation. What I'm interested in is, why do you think it was that Darwin's idea was seen as so dangerous rather than simply nonsensical? For the first 50 years, there wasn't enough information to make Darwin's idea anything other than implausible and irreverent. Why was it seen as so dangerous at that time?
Well, in spite of Darwin's best efforts, the implications were there for anybody to draw, and that is, he's not just talking about birds and bees and flowers. He's talking about us. He's talking about our minds. He's talking about our conscience, our soul. Everything, if Darwin is right, is made up of little ratchets doing their little ratchety thing. And it's all just mechanical and blind and purposeless at the bottom. And this was the great inversion, because until then, the idea that there was something like a life force, élan vital, or that there was something like a soul that was completely distinct from matter, and that it somehow informed and controlled and guided creative processes, thinking processes, moral reasoning, and so forth. This top-down idea about morality and self and soul was very plausible until Darwin. And after Darwin, people could see that maybe the soul could be replaced with some of those ratchets. And that's a very threatening idea.
So if Darwin had not produced this dangerous idea, do you think that the development of infidelity, atheism, or disbelief, or however one wants to call it, would have been delayed?
I suppose that's a historical question that one should do very careful research on, and I haven't. But it seems very plausible to me that it was Darwin that broke the dam. Because before Darwin, there really wasn't a good answer to the question, how did this come to be? How did this bird with this wonderful wing, how did it come into existence? If not by some divine act of creation. The rhetorical question, what else could it be, had no answer. That was what William Paley had said, and I think it's important to realize that Paley's argument from design is actually very, very powerful. It challenges any thinker to come up with an alternative. And Darwin called his bluff. He didn't deny the Paley argument. He said, I'm going to meet it head on. Yes, there's fantastic design in the biosphere, and I'm going to show you how you can get that design without a designer.
However, even if Darwin had succeeded in demonstrating how you can get the illusion of design without having to postulate the existence of a designer, it's still hard to resolve the problem of the relationship between minds and brains, so that philosophers, like Descartes, for example, had long ago insisted that the brain and mind were entirely separate, and even now there's a persistent belief that the mind, the soul, or whatever you want to call it, has an immaterial existence. Well, Daniel Dennett has written eloquently about the problem of consciousness, so I asked him about Darwin's attitude to this problem. Why was it that Descartes was able to preserve the immaterial soul, and Darwin somehow felt, albeit a Christian, that he did not feel it possible to preserve a comparable sanctuary?
That's a good question, and especially because Wallace was able to make precisely the Cartesian move. Wallace, the co-discoverer of natural selection, said that it covered everything up to the human soul. And he drew the line there, exactly where Descartes drew the line. Wallace said, no, we have to make an exception for the human mind. And Darwin famously wrote him a letter saying, I think you will kill our child. To Darwin, it was clear that the Cartesian stop, the Maginot Line, was indefensible, simply because it was clear that we're primates, we're mammals. The continuity of nature was not going to permit one species on the planet to have miracle stuff in its brain when no other species did. I was once interviewed in Italy, and the headline of the interview the next day was wonderful. I saved this for my collection. It was, Sì, abbiamo un'anima, ma è fatta di tanti piccoli robot. Yes, we have a soul, but it's made of lots of tiny robots. And I thought, exactly right. Yes, we have a soul, but it's mechanical. But it's still a soul. It still does the work that the soul was supposed to do. It is the seat of reason. It is the seat of moral responsibility. It's why we are appropriate objects of punishment when we do evil things, why we deserve the praise when we do good things. It's just not a mysterious lump of wonder stuff.
Which will outlive us.
Which will outlive us, yes. We do have to give that up. And I'm sure that that's a big part of the inexhaustible appeal of the idea of a soul. All you have to confront is the task of consoling a child whose parent has died, and the natural appeal of the idea of a soul that goes on living it's just undeniable. It takes a strong person indeed not to avail himself of that crutch when responding to a child who's just facing the loss of a loved one.
Or indeed an adult facing the loss of a loved adult as well.
Sure,
I mean,
sure.
The loss of anyone. So that,
sure.
Really we're saying that the notion of an immaterial soul, by definition, because it's immaterial, is that it's also indestructible.
I think the source of the idea of the immaterial soul that lives on after death is probably largely connected with the fact that the purpose of our living souls, the purpose of our brains, is to project into the future. It's to foresee the future and to have plans and hopes about the future. And those projects and plans and anticipations make us who we are. And we share them. And so we know that the anticipated trajectories of people, and we have our own anticipations for their trajectories. We have hopes for our children and fears for our friends when they go off and do dangerous things. And it's this forward-looking, future-producing activity of the nervous system which we can't just turn off. And when somebody dies, all of those projects are suddenly put into abeyance. It's hard to turn them off. And so the most natural thing in the world to go on thinking about them. And thinking about, well, if Sam were still here, he'd be saying this and we'd be doing this. And it's a short step from there to say, well, he is still here. Well, not here, but here.
But I find it very hard to see how they can actually formulate or conceive the notion of an immaterial continuity of an unembodied self, of how it would know that it was in fact the thing that had once been the embodied person with a particular name, with particular projects. It always seems to me that the project, the notion of projects and trajectories and hopes and plans and so forth are all tied up with being embodied.
Oh yes, and I think that everybody cheats when they think about this. I mean, in the way that scientists cheat too when they imagine hard to imagine things. So people, when they imagine an immaterial soul, they don't. They imagine a sort of ghosty, sort of semi-transparent material object that's got arms and legs and a particular physical location, but just isn't quite physical. It's sort of like a hologram, and they know that that's not right. They know that a soul isn't really like that, and they know they can't really imagine an immaterial, disembodied soul. But that's all right. These things are hard to imagine, and physicists can't imagine quantum mechanics, and we can't imagine an immaterial soul. But we can try, and it doesn't hurt to think about people playing harps sitting on clouds. No, I often ask my students when they were children and reading comic books or they were watching on television, did it ever bother them that Casper the Friendly Ghost could both fly through a wall and catch a ball? I said, why doesn't the ball just go right through his hand? And almost all of them say, oh yes, they had noticed this mildly discomforting inconsistency, but everybody goes along with the gag. But everybody notices that this is not really consistent.
All right then. Given the fact that both you and I subscribe to a radical, unreformed Darwinism, how do we live with the notion of the mechanization of our own picture, the radical mechanization of our own picture? What does it leave us with as persons if in fact we turn out to be these products of ratcheting?
Well, I think it leaves us almost exactly where we've always been. We get a clearer view of the actual machinery of our souls, if you like. But what we thought our souls were for, what they were good for loving and for deciding, for making and breaking promises for reasons good and bad, that goes on. And we're just a little bit less disillusioned, I should say, about the nature of that process. But our moral quandaries are what they were before. Our moral aspirations are what they were before. Our capacity to love or to hate are intact. When I speak about Darwinism as universal acid, it passes through, it changes everything, and it leaves everything the same too.